Okay, so I wanted to go back to the Jack Ryan books and talk a little bit about Cardinal the Kremlin, which I just finished rereading. There's a rumor running around, it's been running around for years, like was Tom Clancy a CIA asset? We know he wasn't an employee, but was he getting information from somebody? And was that information being used to have him put it in a book and have it kind of scare the Russians into thinking different things? Because, some of the stuff in the book was very close to reality, sort of bleeding edge technology, and had a whole lot of things in it where you're like, is that really possible? Can you really do that? So I'm trying to go back and read these with an eye of looking backwards, 40 years, because some of these are 40-year-old books, to say, is there really a red flag to that, or is it just people like to talk and that's what it is? So let's look a little bit about the timeline first. So this was the third book Tom Clancy published. It was published behind Red October and Red Storm Rising. Red Storm Rising, of course, is not a Jack Ryan related book. If you're interested in it, it's written with Larry Bond. There's a nice. I did a video of it for the channel. It's on here somewhere. If you look at the overall Jack Ryan timeline of books instead of just publication order, Without Remorse is really first. It was set in the early 70s. Patriot Games comes second, which actually predates Hunt for Red October in the Jack Ryan timeline. Red Rabbit comes third, which was published much later. Hunt for Red October is fourth in the Jack Ryan timeline. This is actually sixth, but it was really the second Jack Ryan book published. So the third Jack Ryan book published right behind Patriot Games and Hunt for Red October. So there's one Jack Ryan book that actually predates this in the timeline, Red Rabbit, and it came out much later. So there were three Jack Ryan books. This is the third Jack Ryan book. There were two before it. The opening of the book is pretty interesting. It is opening with an Afghan freedom fighter taking out a Russian helicopter with a shoulder-fired missile. And at the time when this was written, we were giving a lot of weapons and training to the Afghans to help them fight Russia in their country, something we might later come to regret, but hindsight's always 2020, right? So Jack is at the CIA full time now, and the book kind of opens after the Afghan freedom fighters taking out Russian helicopters. The book kind of opens with Marco Ramius and Jack, Marco from Hunt for Red October, obviously, watching Red October being taken out for the last time because the Navy's learned everything they're going to learn from her. They're going to just sink her someplace and be done with it. That way they can never get blamed for having had her if you go hide it somewhere. Um, but the book in particular is really about a very well placed source at in Russia that has been feeding us information for decades, and more importantly, about a laser weapon system that we were developing as part of the SDI, which is commonly known as Star Wars Space Defense Initiative or something like that, but SDI program. And the Russians had a parallel program to ours, and it's an interesting take because all the time we were talking about arms negotiations and arms reduction. Both sides are, of course, developing all kinds of new weapons. So we're like, hey, let's reduce arms. Let's get rid of those old ones in favor of these new ones, right? These weapons were largely defensive in nature, although neither country really developed one that could truly take out an incoming missile. That was always kind of the idea. And some of the stuff presented in the book about the laser is at the time I don't think would have been possible. But of course, you can always take the idea and sort of extend it out as a fiction writer. But let me put my science hat on for a second. I'm not sure some of the stuff in the book would have been possible at that time. Um, and the Tom Clancy goes into great length to point out that it doesn't count at arms control, or ask basically the question: does it count as arms control for giving our weapons to our enemy for giving weapons to our military, but we aren't giving to various people to fight for our enemies? So, does it count as arms control? Like if we're giving stuff to the Afghans, are we really reducing our stockpile? And does that really count as arms control? Well, only if we admit we're giving them to the Afghans, right? But they go to great length to kind of justify, well, let's reduce our arms, and the meanwhile, let's send them out the back door over to the Afghans. That doesn't really count, right? That's nothing to see here. And legally, you could probably make that argument. Ethically and morally, it's a whole different story. But legally, you could get away with it. But while discussing arms control, Jack Ryan and his CIA buddies find a new development being built somewhere in Russia, requiring great amounts of electricity. It's high up in the mountains. They had to build a whole dam to power it, but there's got much more power than they really need to power the little city that's there. But so they start looking at this installation that they have up there, which turns out to be the Russians' laser weapon. But and early on in the book, they're talking about Cardinal. Hardly anybody knows what Cardinal is. Who is it? And why is it he's sending us the best information ever? Turns out the Cardinal is actually a guy named Colonel Mikhail Semyonovich, which no way I can truly pronounce that correctly, but he goes by Mission. Um, but Filatov. He's a personal aide to the Soviet Minister of Defense, and he's a war hero. He's essentially won three Hero of the Soviet Union, which is sort of their equivalent of our Medal of Honor. He won three of them in World War II. Uh, he has been passing military, technical, and political intelligence information to the CIA as their highest agent in place, codenamed Cardinal, for years. He lost his wife, his children have passed away. He's an old man who suffered a lot for his country, and he just wants peace. And he sees the people running the country that don't really want peace so much. So he's this agent that's sending us stuff. Now, is that based on a real agent? Who knows if that was based on a real agent or not, or if it was just a plot device. I've never found anything that said this was based on a real occurrence. I've never found anything, and I looked to say how high up did we ever have a source, and this would have been crazy high up. Of course, I can only look at public information, so who knows? If it was me writing it, and I do write some fiction books, and I wanted to scare somebody and say, look, where would I need a source? It was like the best ever, and I could find out everything. This would be the ideal place. So, of course, a guy like this would be the one you want to turn. So I think it's just an interesting plot device. I don't think there's any indication that he had information come from anybody, at least on that one. Um, but he did do a very deep dive on Cardinal and kind of what drove him to turn on his country and start sending us stuff. But the interesting thing to me is Ryan starts to look at some of what the Soviets are doing, and he kind of goes to his boss at the CIA and says, "Hey, look, I've seen this. I don't know what it is." They send him out to this facility in New Mexico to look at a laser weapon we have, and it turns out, an expert out there looks at the Soviet installation and goes, "They're building a laser, right?" Because you go to the subject matter expert, that's not unusual. So Los Alamos National Labs, I think, is where they sent him. They sent him somewhere in New Mexico. It's the only national lab out there. So it stands to reason that that would be someplace an agent would go. Now, is that indication that Clancy, knew something out there was going on? I think he just knew Los Alamos National Labs and sent, picked that and said go. So I think it's just a plot device. I don't think it's any indication that he was had information flowing the right direction. But he does go to great length to describe Clancy does go to great length to describe what he believes makes a good military officer. And I found this kind of interesting because he tried to join the military and couldn't for various medical reasons. But he did go to great length to point out something. And as a former enlisted soldier, I kind of agreed with him. He said it's somebody who works hard, who admits fully when he doesn't know something, will learn it and come back to you. So, what's your perfect officer? Somebody who works really hard, somebody who knows what they don't know and is fully willing to admit what they don't know and kind of go back and find out the right information and bring it forward for his team. Great, great description of what makes a good officer. And when I was in the military, there were some like that, and there were some that really weren't like that. They were more managers than leaders. But Clancy does go to great length to describe just how stressful and exhausting combat operations really are. So he uses a flashback for this Russian tank commander, the one that turned into the Cardinal, to go through and talk about something that happened during World War II. And he went to great length to describe just how exhausting it is to be in one of those situations. And he got it pretty much right. I mean, I know a lot of combat vets. I'm not one, but I do know I'm not in a sense of something along the lines of Iraq or Afghanistan. I got out of the military in 1996, so it was a much different time when I was in. But it to me these larger combat operations, Iraq, Afghanistan, World War II, those are some of the most exhausting things a human being can do. I mean, they're just both mentally, emotionally, physically exhausting. And when you come out of it, you just like pass out. But Clancy also goes to great length to point out that the actual life of a spy is not comfortable. It's more cramped, risky, stressful, basically driven by nothing other than patriotism. You don't really get paid a lot to do it. Your life's kind of always if you're a true spy, your life could always be in danger. So, it's not something people do for the money. And it's certainly not something you do for career after the agency because what are you going to do? Go to like, Microsoft or Google and say, hey, look, I was a spy for the CIA. I need a job. I retired at, 45, 50, whatever. It really has no transferable skills as such. Um, but with this entire novel, he's trying to point out just how much difference I think one really well placed intelligence source can do. What one really well placed intelligence source can do, and why it's so important to have those human assets around the world if you want to be the victor in a war. Force on force military, put a bunch of tanks out in the field, right? You can duke it out. But wars are won and lost on intelligence, right? So if you know how to develop the right strategy, you can win or lose. If you don't know how to develop that right strategy, you're kind of basing it on luck, right? You want as much intelligence information as you can get. And Clancy goes throughout this entire novel, his whole point is to point out how important that is. And at the time, the CIA had a lot of assets we were developing all over the world, and we were a lot more human intelligence based than we are today, which mostly we're sensor intelligence based now. Or at least we were for a while. It might be a little bit different now. The Russians, though, are doing their best. The interesting thing about the facility up on the hill, and that this is one of the things that Cardinal sent to the CIA through his channels, was that the Russians are placing their best functional people at that facility, right? The best ones they could get. They're sending up generals, they're sending up guards, they're sending up everything they need to make sure that laser facility stays intact. But Clancy even goes to as far as to say, okay, in a practice run, the Russians take a dead satellite and shoot it with a laser to see what does it, right? And it turns it into like a piece of plastic that's been heated too much in the sun and curls it up and melts it. And just by sheer happenstance and luck, we happened to be looking at that satellite, when they did it. Some Navy guys were doing a field exercise and like, hey, let's practice with our equipment. Let's look at that satellite. And it happened to be the exact moment that the Russians took it down. Yeah, the odds of that occurring are roughly zero. This is just a plot point. This is not like we were fed. This I don't feel like Tom Clancy would have ever been fed information like that, right? That hey, look, we watched as they did it. Partially because nobody ever developed a laser strong enough to do that from the ground. It's just too problematic. But in the book, the Strategic Defense Initiative, actually, and I got a kick out of this. He described a facility that they were going through, Tom Clancy did, as the inspiration for the game Dungeons and Dragons. I said it clearly developed a dungeon, right? These intel agencies are not nice office spaces. They're not, hey, big open spaces. Hey, James Bond and the feet up on the desk with the whiskey, right? These are cramped little offices and cubicles. It's not fun, right? It's just like any other big giant office building. But he described it as a game of as the inspiration for a dungeon in Dungeons and Dragons, which I found hilarious, being somebody who plays D&D. But the thing I like about Clancy's writing is he wants everybody to know the tiniest detail. So a lot of times mystery writers or action thriller writers will want to include details, and you're never quite sure if they're necessary or not. And I think if Clancy was writing today, I think he'd be heavily edited back. I don't think they'd let some of the stuff out on the market. But part of this, I think, speaks to a hint at who Clancy might have been, because I'm not even sure in the 80s you could have gotten some of the level of detail he goes through out. Because even in this book, which was only the third book he'd ever published, he had detail in it that's just absolutely not necessary to the store, right? So he goes into great detail about how this spy is buying clothes at this one place because it's a dead drop, and she just keeps going in and buying clothes to go in the fitting room and grab something. And she's like, oh, well, he always pays cash. So the store loves her and they give her a discount, because he goes into detail about, hey, look, when you use your credit card, the retailer gets charged a percentage. And it's completely unnecessary to the story, but it's a detail that gets in there at kind of great length. And I'm not sure Tom Clancy was a big enough name at the time to have that kind of stuff survive editors, unless he was getting help from somewhere. I could be completely wrong. I never published a book in the 80s, and all my stuff is self-published, but he had so much detail in there that normally I would think an editor would rip it out. I don't know how he got away with having that level of detail. Is all of it necessary? No, it's not. But it is nice that he puts it in there. But I think that also speaks to Clancy's ego. If you ever watch him in interviews that are still all over YouTube, the dude clearly had an ego. He wanted you to know he was the smartest guy in the room whenever he was there. But the other interesting thing I found is that he goes to great length, and this is absolutely true, to describe just how badly the Russians were getting their butt kicked in Afghanistan with the shoulder fire missile supply. And I was kind of a teenager when this came out, so yeah, I remember that being on the news that the Russians were not doing well in Afghanistan. How widely known it was us that were feeding those shoulder fired missiles. I'm sure it was known. He probably just used this as a plot device, but he went to great length to describe it. And to me, it kind of says, if I'm a writer trying to scare the Russians, if I'm a CIA asset trying to scare the Russians, you know, is it interesting? It's an interesting idea to use something like these a group of people who don't have much, like the Afghans are, give them some of our primitive weaponry, not our good stuff. Give them sort of our B level stuff, and say, hey, look, they're kicking your ass with our B stuff. You don't want us to show up on the battlefield, right? So, um, is that a feint? Is that a hint? Is that something that could have, sort of weakened the resolve of an enemy in the Cold War? I think that whole Afghan thing was, whether or not this book was what put him over the edge, who knows? But obviously not. But the fear sure that just that thought process of how much our sort of B level weaponry with not the best team in the world is really kicking their butt. I think went a long way into ending the Cold War. Um, Now, Clancy does do something that I found really, really interesting personally, because I've worked on missile defense programs in my career. I don't anymore. I work in a completely different place now. I'm not in defense anymore, but he went to great length to explain why a missile defense program is actually needed. Things like Patriot missile, things like laser weapons to shoot down incoming missiles, things like these anti-missile missiles, Standard Missile 3, some others that are out there. Um, if you have a missile shield, it protects your military from uh, incoming missiles, right? We saw it in the Gulf War, Scud missiles taken down by Patriot. It's a great thing. Um, Iron Dome takes down incoming rockets. It's a great thing to have that ability to defend. It also Clancy goes to a great length to point out that if somebody had a really good one of these that took down everything without fail, or 99% of everything without fail, it could be possible to win a nuclear war. He also goes to great lengths to say, does anybody really win in a nuclear war? Because in my opinion, there's no winner in a nuclear exchange. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were a much more primitive device than what we have today, shockingly small by comparison. Two devices launched, in World War II. If I were president, I don't know what I would have done. All I can do is look backward and say they were. But I can tell you that the size of those devices, the yield of those devices, the megatons involved, the kilotons involved, are shockingly different than what we have today. What we have today is a lot bigger, a lot more accurate, and there's a crap ton more of them. So would anybody actually win in a nuclear war? I don't think so. And I've actually written a book about nuclear war, so it is what it is. So the whole sort of book culminates with Cardinal getting into trouble and having to be extracted, and there's this whole arguments of, shouldn't we extract this asset who's given us so much because it's going to be noticed. And yeah, that is the sort of decision that goes on. So let's say you had an asset that's that big, right? Somebody who's won 3 hero of the Soviet Unions, and all of a sudden you need to extract them and have them defect to this country. It'd be like somebody with, multiple Medal of Honors, disappearing and going to Russia. They're going to notice, right? So, you have to really kind of take that for what it's worth and say, would you extract it? Would you not? And Clancy goes to great lengths to understand the thought process a president would go through, because that's really a president level decision on whether or not you extract somebody like that. Or do you just leave him to the Russians? Because he was getting in trouble, and that we had to go see if we could extract him, which is sort of the tail end of the book. But the thing that gets me about this book when it comes to, was Clancy or was he not? Um, it There were 2 things. So, there's 2 things and 3 things in this really that sort of stand out as where did he get that information? Could it have been gotten through through sort of public information? And Clancy said he got everything publicly, and maybe he did. He was an insurance salesman, so maybe he was really good at just taking little tiny bits of things and connecting those dots. And maybe that's all there is to it. But he has this in-depth conversation about artificial intelligence. Remember, this book was published in 1988, so he described the problem in getting enough data pushed through the AI fast enough to make a difference, which in '88 would have been a problem, especially when you deal with trying to solve some of these mirror problems that the laser was having. And I work with AI. He's exactly right. Everything he described was just exactly right for the problems they would have had at the time. And the only reason we have AI working today is we have cloud computing and our processors are faster and we have a bunch more memory and much larger data sets. So AI is a lot different than it was. And he was using AI as a way to control the mirrors to get the laser to go exactly the way he wanted to. And he's the way he would have used it is the way I would have used it. But that's one that made me look at it and go, he's got a lot of stuff. I don't know how widely that was known, right? And he described it exactly right. And that's an area I'm actually familiar with. Um, so decent images. So moving on to part two of that, the next thing he had that I thought wasn't necessarily all that known. At the time, to get decent images of something, satellites weren't always as common, right? So we didn't have the satellite networks we have today. But Clancy goes to great length to talk about the SR-71 and how just awesome that thing was for its time, how useful it was. Currently, it's sort of outdated and they've all been retired, I believe. I think they're all museum pieces now. But at the time, it was absolutely imperative to use. And he goes to great length to describe exactly what it's like to fly one of those, exactly what it's like to be in one of those things. And that one, when I read the book, I was like, well, okay, maybe he got some information from someplace. And then I started looking at some old documentaries. I'm like, no, you can actually get this stuff publicly. So the SR-71 stuff that sort of raised a flag for me initially, I went back and proved myself wrong and said, no way. But what got me was his discussion of the laser. So now I actually do have a PhD in physics and I've worked with all kinds of weird technology over the years. And the way he describes the problems of taking a laser on the surface of the Earth and hitting something in orbit were dead on. And I mean, absolutely dead on. Dead on so good that I actually had to sit down and bust out some textbooks to kind of go, is this right? Is that, did he get this right? Did he get that right? And turns out he was dead on the money. Now, this is 2024, right? He did this in 1988. How widely known was that? Because laser technology has come a long way in the last however many years it's been. So did he get that information from someplace or did he sort of piece it together from public sources? You could have done it from public sources. If he wasn't getting information from someplace and getting somebody to talk, I think he at least had a subject matter expert on lasers. Somebody at a local university. There's a couple of good ones in Washington, D.C., where he lived. A lot of guys at DARPA, at Annapolis, and others who would have been sort of laser jocks at the time. And laser guys really do refer to themselves as laser jocks. I'm not making that up. Um, it, but that particular bit, when I read that section, I had to go sit down and look at it. And I'm, this is sort of physics is my bread and butter, right? So I looked at it, I was like, he's exactly right. And it's freakishly how exactly right he is on all the problems you would have trying to take a surface of the Earth laser and knock something out in orbit. It's really hard to do. And there's a reason they looked at, can we put these things in space, right? So he had that exactly right. Now, was he getting that information from a classified source? The problems you have can't really necessarily be classified because they all derive from basic physics. And somebody with enough basic physics background said, "Hey, look, if you want to solve a problem with lasers on the surface of the Earth knocking something out, you could figure it out." And it's not exactly the easiest thing in the world to do, but it can be done, and it could have been done from sources at the time. But would an insurance salesman be the guy who figured that out without somebody else helping him? I think on that one he had help. Don't know that it was a government source, but I think he at least had help from somewhere. And the reason I think that is I went and talked to some older physicists who were PhDs at the time. I was in high school at the time. I was coming close to graduating high school at the time. So who knows? I couldn't have told you what sources were truly available then and what wasn't. But the guys I know who are older than I am and now retired have been like, yeah, you probably could have figured it out, but could an insurance salesman have done it without help? The answer was no. Did you have to have access to classified information? The answer was probably not. We couldn't get a definitive no, but the answer was probably not. So could he have just gotten this one from somebody and sort of pieced it together in a very creative way? He could have, and he nailed it exactly right. So the physics in this book is very Tom Clancy-esque. He popped it perfectly. I hope that I know that doesn't really answer the question of was he an asset or was he just an author, and I'm still going to try to sort that out. So I'm going to go on finish. I'm going to keep reading other books, and odds are I'm probably not going to be able to answer that question any better than anybody else. But there's a few tidbits throughout this man's career that make me look at it and go, you know what? He was either the luckiest guy on the planet or he was getting information from somebody, and maybe it was a combination of those two. But either way, it's entertaining. Some of the tech in the book is of course a little outdated. Of course, the Cold War's over, so you do have to put yourself in the sort of 80s mindset. But the book is still highly entertaining, at least it was to me. So if you get the chance to read it, I highly recommend it. Everybody have a great day.